Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est un grand honneur d'être invité à l'Académie avec la permission de Monsieur le Secrétaire perpétuel. Je voudrais présenter le discours en anglais aussi parce que les problèmes qui seront exprimés ou discutés concernent plutôt les États-Unis. So this is an extremely interesting conference where people take it for granted that freedom of expression is a fundamental value, and there might be debate about its application. But I must confess that I see at the moment that there are other forces in society and freedom of which do not cherish it. And at the end of the day, social values, including fundamental values, depend on the social attitudes. And although law at the moment seems to resist, to some extent, these changing social attitudes, the process really is not favoring these fundamental values, and this is to some extent reflected in law, or it is certainly turning law and jurisprudence into a battlefield. But one cannot take it for granted, but I think we all agree that free speech is here forever as an absolute value. It is contested, and there is a process of social erosion that we have to take into consideration. Of course, lawyers and judges in particular tend to take fundamental rights like free speech for granted. Indeed, that's what we are paid for. Free speech is understood as an individual right which is protected as long as an utterance or sign is considered to be speech. But speech is a term of art in law. Justice Holmes of the Supreme Court of the United States stated in 1919 the First Amendment, that is to say the American rule on free speech. So the First Amendment is not immunity from every possible use of language. In Europe, very weighty reasons are needed for governmental restriction of speech, and except where it causes well-defined, more or less actual harm, speech is to be protected. More harm caused by speech is tolerated than might otherwise be warranted, and certain harms caused by speech are discounted. That follows from the value of freedom of expression. Or at least this is what free speech advocates like myself dream. In fact, this dream is challenged because of developments on the internet. Now, until very recently, there seems to be a European consensus that free speech shall be applicable, or freedom of expression shall be applicable to the internet, and this was accepted by the member states of the Council of Europe, 47 states. But this was 10 years ago, and there are developments which indicate that there will be a special regime for the internet, and that regime might be very different from what is provided for the press. And we have already seen that even when it comes to the press, there are certain divergences. Now, there is an advantage in accepting that freedom of expression is of supreme value. It becomes an axiom, and therefore little thought goes into the reasons behind the acceptance of the axiom. This is convenient. It saves soul-searching and mind-boggling analysis of additional interests to be taken into consideration. But this assumption, this axiom, once again, is questioned. especially in the context of the Internet. The love affair with the web, which was prevailing 20 years ago, and the love affair with social media seems to be coming to an end, at least in some quarters. Let me quote His Excellency, the Turkish President, Mr. Erdogan himself, who said recently, "I am increasingly against the Internet every day." End of quotation. There seems to be tremendous pressure on Internet freedom of speech on the Internet. Any shift here will have wide-ranging implications on free speech in general, and not only because the Internet emerges as the most important forum of influence today and certainly in the future. These are the hottest issues today in freedom of expression at the level of courts. Guy already referred to a case called Elonis, which is pending in the Supreme Court of the United States. That's an internet harassment case, has nothing to do with political speech, it's sexual harassment. And the European Court of Human Rights will decide soon a case called Delphi, which is about comments to an internet article which allegedly are of racist nature. So this shows that the internet freedom of speech on the internet is at crossroads. Now, this kind of challenge is not new in the history of freedom of expression. Similar challenges emerged 50 years ago in the case of broadcasting, and that challenge ended in restricting freedom of speech in broadcasting. The fundamental assumption today is that freedom of the press and freedom of broadcasting are different, even if they are treated together, like in the 1881 French Press Act to some extent, but then the exceptions turn it into a different regime. The reasons are that this is a licensed activity, broadcasting. It is sending synchronous message to a large audience with direct emotional effect, and in the case of television, with the power of images which have allegedly uncontrollable effect on the mind and behavior. And so this assumption of direct effect on a large audience through images which bypasses rational discourse creates a regime where freedom of the press considerations do not fully apply. I will not comment on that. I just mentioned that when it comes to a new media, there is a danger that what we take for generally applicable will not be generally applicable. And the same situation, or a comparable situation, emerges in the context of the Internet. Here, in the context of the Internet, private, ordinary communication of individuals are capable of reaching a large audience, even if it's not targeted, as in the case of the Internet, and they also rely on the power of images very often. Those who wish to impose greater censorship over Internet speech conceive the Internet as a unique space in which the risks and harms are magnified. Martha Nussbaum, a really leading American intellectual and former colleague of mine, wrote that what is distinctive about the Internet is that it is its own world, and a world in which values can be remade. The person who was free, happy, and autonomous can be turned into a thing there and then silenced, violated for all the world and all the time. Professor Citron frames the issue as this: today's cyber attack groups update a history of anonymous mobs coming together to victimize and subjugate vulnerable people. So this new challenge forces even the unwilling legislator and the judge to go beyond the axiom that speech is a fundamental individual right. And the rethinking occurs in a world of heightened sensitivity. The heightened sensitivities of people heard by internet and social media and I would say social media fields, forces people to build up evidence of the harms of free speech, and the process of rethink begins. What is the concern of Professor Citron or Professor Nussbaum? The concern is the language that is ordinarily used in pubs. Pub speech is vulgar and sexually explicit. It has little communicative value. It serves truth only to a limited extent. But these elements per se do not make it subject to legal intervention in a world based on the assumption that liberty is the default situation. Pub speech, sure, uses extremes. Personal dislike is often expressed in terms like asshole, vermin, etc. Not very pleasant, except if you are drunk enough. In the social convention, at least the one that exists at the pub level, these statements are not understood as factual statements, and they are not considered racist offense except specific circumstances. Then people really understand what these expressions are about. It's not the word vermin, but the context it's used that will turn this into racist speech. And in fact, using an American terminology, then they are fighting words, and there is no misunderstanding in that regard in the pub context. And the same is true about expressions in the pub like, I would kill him. It means just not an incitement to violence, but only an expression of disagreement. You do not need to read John Searle to understand the difference between literal sentence meaning and speaker's utterance meaning. Now, this situation that is well controlled in a pub context, although some judges have rather restrictive interpretations, is presented in a new environment on the internet. And that is what will be the source of uncertainty and misunderstanding. In the US Supreme Court case, the brief argues, if inherently impersonal nature of online communication makes it inherently susceptible to misinterpretation, modern media allow personal reflections intended for a small audience, that was the pub, to be viewed widely by people who are unfamiliar with the context in which the statements were made, and thus who may interpret the statements much differently than the speaker intended. So in other words, what the expression drop dead that was made in the pub does not express intent to call to violence, may be misinterpreted in this diffuse audience, and that causes certain problems. Now, where a message is accessible to a theoretically large audience, there may well be a couple of unknown madmen in the audience. Is the author of the insulting post liable for creating a risk that the madman will act? Well, is a car manufacturer liable under product liability if the car causes an accident only because there are holes on the road? My first answer would be no. The car manufacturer is not liable for the holes on the road. But what if it is known to the car manufacturers that the roads are the country, all the roads are dangerous, and then the manufacturer fails to produce specific brakes or other safety devices? Now, compare this to the internet highway and forget for a moment the fetish of free speech. If there are too many madmen waiting for encouragement with an address of a target available for them, then regulatory intervention might seem to be prudent. But in the above risk aversion calculation, one should not forget the impact of the restrictive measure chosen. The externalities of the restrictive measure are likewise to be taken into consideration. And there is a serious risk that this aspect is lost in the age of heightened personal sensitivities. So in other words, one can argue that indeed the internet is a dangerous highway, and therefore different standards of manufacturing thoughts are applicable. But even if you use that assumption, which is subject, of course, to empirical evidence, which we do not have, we might have, still, this cannot be the end of the discussion, because a specific nature of the speech is to be considered, namely that it has to be overprotected. I will come back to that for institutional purposes. And secondly, when we talk about the nature of the internet highway, full of holes, we assume certain things about human nature which were not part of the assumptions about the democratic policy. We assume that the hole on the highway, the human sensitivity, is something normal, but it's not. It's a social construct. Point number one. Point number two, we assume that humans are violent, brutish, they are just coming out of a Hobbesian zoo. Again, and therefore they will react when they read stupidities on the internet. That is not the understanding of the political society as we know it today. Maybe Hobbes is right. Maybe our assumptions about the democratic society are wrong. But you cannot have both. You can't say on the one hand that individuals are expected to reason according to the Kantian assumption, sapere aude, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to consider them to be childish and brutish, unable to exercise intellectual control over their behavior. And that's really what is at the heart of this debate, aggravated by the fact of what I call, and I will come back to this, increased social sensitivity, which is a narcissistic syndrome. Nussbaum and company argue that harms associated with internet speech include psychological distress, loss of physical security, loss of economic and social opportunities, and loss of privacy. But some of the members of this intellectual community go even further. They emphasize harms to a larger community, as they contend internet speech spreads false information, encourages extremism, and endorses or justifies discrimination and violence. And they also propose ways to limit the resulting harm by introducing enlightened censorship. I am not here to deny that there are very serious problems in internet harassment, especially where it can be demonstrated that there is a risk. When, for example, a person's home address, social security number, private image are made public and accompanied with a harassing message or even a threat of violence. This is not the kind of insult you hear in a pub. It's much more serious than that. It is a credible risk that the threat will be carried out. And of course, in such cases, law enforcement has a vital role in protecting a person's safety. But those who advocate internet regulations go far beyond cases of concrete harm. Harm is defined much more broadly than, let's say, as it was defined by John Stuart Mill. Harm may be defined broadly as a series of acts, none of which is individually harmful, and it can injure the interests of a group rather than any identifiable individual. So this is the major shift that occurs in the internet speech censorship community, that the harm on the internet is not individual, it is collective. Let me quote another colleague from Chicago, Brian Leiter. He wrote, "In a slogan most non-mundane speech people engage in is largely worthless, and the world would be better off were it not expressed. The internet is the final confirmation of this truth. So once again, we got from a certainly idealized position underlying freedom of expression, which was based on the assumption of equal cognitive capacities of all, to a position where people are considered to be speakers of speech of no value. And that assumption seems to become the norm. And once that assumption becomes the norm, namely that people are producers of non-valuable speech, then of course there will be no reason to sustain freedom of expression. So that's really what is at stake. Of course, there is a fundamental legal objection to this because it presupposes content discrimination. It presupposes that someone, especially a judge or a lawmaker, is in the position to determine what is valuable content of speech and what's not. It's a very elitist position, and it's extremely restrictive of speech. But that's where we are. I would like to say that, especially because content discrimination is not considered a major shortcoming in European jurisprudence, that content discrimination is a serious problem, and we do exercise that, we do allow it, although, if I may quote the Supreme Court of the United States, it runs the risk of singling out bad views will become is simply not justified. There is a problem with fallibility because someone has to say which content is acceptable, which one is not, and people are just making mistakes in that regard, so there is fallibility. Government is always biased because power is biased. There is prejudice stemming from unpopularity of views, etc., etc. So content discrimination is extremely risky. And this is clearly a matter of approach that is in opposition of regulation which is based on the actual consequences of speech. And therefore, it will suppress unpopular ideas, and the public debate will be manipulated by coercion rather than persuasion. So this is the problem with content discrimination. Content regulation is self-destructive. If you single out one opinion, there is nothing to stop you, to stop others to single out your right-minded views once you are in the minority. And people, at the end of the day, might end up in the minority. Let me return briefly to this American phenomenon, which of course has its parallels in Europe. How come that the American liberal elite seems to move away from robust First Amendment for the sake of a new paternalism? And this is really a new paternalism. It's the favorite quote from John Stuart Mill is that, and this is in Mill, free speech is not for children. I mean, we heard 3 or 4 times quotes from John Stuart Mill here, but was not quoted during these 36 hours, was never mentioned that there was a very troubling precondition in John Stuart Mill. And that was, this applies to mature people, mature societies, and it does not apply to societies which are not. And of course it has a colonial overtone and so on, a lot of prejudice in that, but that is the precondition in the whole discussion in John Stuart Mill. So we are facing a real challenge. Now that paternalism of Mill, because he says it doesn't apply outside England, let's put it frankly, doesn't apply outside England. This scholarship here considers the world to be outside England of the 19th century. We are all below the level of maturity of the clubs Mill avoided to attend. And this is, by the way, a neuroscience-infested paternalism. It was really great that this conference brought in latest developments in neuroscience. This kind of paternalism I was referring to relies on neuroscience saying there is no free will, and therefore it is not, one has to guide people. One has to guide people because they are unable, they don't have the capacity. That's it. Now what is left out? That the heart of the matter in free speech is exchange of ideas. Even if one is not capable of determining his speech or his acts in the sense of free speech, in the sense of the assumptions of free speech. A person is all the time subjected to social control. That's part of determinism, if you wish. And social institutions do have an influence on individual behavior, exactly because of determinism. So, in a way, law, social control, exchange of ideas, the views of others do have a deterministic impact. And it's exactly in order to have that deterministic impact that you need free speech. Otherwise, the determination in the absence of free will be one coming from the majority, silencing majority, as Mill has foreseen, and it will come from government and public media manipulation. So this is exactly why you need free speech. Otherwise, there will be an overdetermination, exactly in the absence of individual free will. And that's, I think, an additional reason to stand up on normative grounds for free speech. And there is indeed a possibility to influence freedom of thought by social institutions. Let me move to the final point I wanted to share with you. I refer to the problem of sensitivity. I think that one of the major problems of social censorship today, the reason why internet speech is going to be restricted, originates from a cult of sensitivity. The people who feel attacked on the internet have a very high level of sensitivity. They, in a way, hunt for becoming victims. They overestimate their personal importance. They overestimate the threat. This is quite understandable in terms of psychology. But this attitude, this reaction, is the consequence of a social attitude that I call the cult of sensitivity. And that cult of sensitivity responds to vulnerability and victimhood in contemporary society. Now, I'm not denying that there are groups which were victimized and who deserve special protection, but this is now becoming a general trend, and there was reference made to this, that all groups would like to jump the victim bandwagon. And there will be no difference between extremely serious situations which have continued effect and others which are just part of identity. By sensitivity, I mean an increased consideration of the impact in this context. By sensitivity, I mean an increased consideration of the impact of the speech on the audience, where consideration and weight is given to the personal feelings generated by this speech. This goes clearly against fundamental assumptions of freedom of expression, which was protecting the speaker and not the audience. This is now changing. This is reversed. And there will be no freedom of expression where audience sensitivity is prevailing to the detriment of a speaker's right. The restrictive interpretation of freedom of speech puts respect for sensitivities into the foreground. The affected person determines what the sensitivity is, since in the end only he or she can feel it. So feelings will determine, the feelings of the audience will determine the speech, the limits of speech. The increased respect for public sensitivity is noticeable in the freedom of expression jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. If I may quote one of François' favorite cases, she had nothing to do with it. It's Otto Preminger Institute in Austria. This is a case where a group wanted to show at a private in Austria a film that was considered blasphemous. There was advertisement that this blasphemous film will be shown at a private hearing, a private screening. The public prosecutor banned this show, and the European Court of Human Rights sided with Austria and with the public prosecutor, said that yes, this ban was absolutely okay. The reason, I quote, "The respect for the religious feelings of believers as guaranteed in Article 9, that's freedom of religion, can legitimately be thought to have been violated by provocative portrayals of objects of religious veneration, and such portrayals can be regarded as malicious violation of the spirit of tolerance, which must also be a feature of democratic society." I emphasize, can be regarded as malicious. Well, it can be regarded if you wish so, but not necessarily when you cherish freedom of expression. Anyway, this is a law which is probably still relatively good law, notwithstanding Wieniawski, which tried to make it a little bit less harsh. Now, beyond the religious sphere, sensibility became a matter of concern and force because the general culture became more responsive to arguments of vulnerability. It became a useful claim and finally a source of rights that you demonstrate vulnerability. This resonates well with a certain concept of justice, where vulnerability is a matter of past victimhood. It is accepted that past large-scale injustices are to be remedied, and as is the case with racially persecuted or mentally disabled who were subject to structural prejudice. And I must say, I wrote judgments. I can't disclose which because it's secret, but I very much stood up for, in certain drafts I prepared, to undo structural prejudice regarding the mentally disabled. And I think this statement is relatively non-controversial. The problem is the extension of this consideration. Given this rights-framing advantage, individuals, even those outside the traditionally and demonstrably disadvantaged groups, have a personal interest in presenting themselves as vulnerable and offended. And this interest is socially reinforced in a narcissistic culture that cultivates personal traits of narcissism. The cult of sensitivity leads to anti-liberal restrictions based on the fear of offense to others. The civility of narcissism will be legally enforced even by criminal law. The risk that governments will overstep the prevention of real harm is heightened online, where the capacity for offensive speech is vast and the link between speech and harm is less clear. While advocates for speech regulations online emphasize cases where people have been gravely harmed, they use the fear of such cases to push for much broader censorship. This censorship does not only protect against violence, but against dignitary harms or broad, diffuse harms associated with reading comments online that offend one's identity. Okay, I thought so. So I guess I should summarize my position. I think that the underlying assumption that of this cult of sensitivity and of the neuroscience, of the new neuroscience-based denial of individual capacities of cognition go against the heart of a democratic society where you don't have to be a believer in Dworkin. It is assumed that people are of equal cognitive capacity. That's the fundamental equality of cognitive capacity that underlies democracy. And this kind of paternalism goes against that fundamental assumption. Now, if we accept, which is just one justification for freedom of speech, that freedom of speech serves democracy, this understanding of the human condition goes against democracy because it denies its fundamental assumptions of equal human capacity. And that's, I think, at the heart of the contemporary debate. And I think this is the frame that one should keep in mind standing up for freedom of expression, which can be abused. It is abused, but the denial, and we are getting to the point of denial through the exceptions, through the special situations, that is going against this fundamental assumption about what we are in a democratic society. Thank you.